Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian. It's great to have you back. Once again, please stop by the website. That's ffipodcast.com. We've got a whole blog full of tons of information, old episodes, highlights, summaries from episodes, new articles, et cetera, et cetera. We're also putting on a ton of programs and courses online, whether it's emergers, dry flies, and nymphing, et cetera. And on this week's show, we've got Bill Longstreet on the line. Bill, you actually are working for a friend of mine who had on the show earlier talking about emergers, and that's Joe DeMalderez. He is an extremely well-known person in the area, not only for his fishing, but he's an all-around, down-the-earth, kind of guy, just a great guy.
Great
so
guy.
I'm
Yeah.
really happy to have you on the show today. You, again, are in Pennsylvania. You fish a lot of the trout waters around there and some of the smallmouth bass waters like the Susquehanna, et cetera. But what's really cool is some of the things that you told me up front about your history, and that is you had a pretty rough pass from a work environment. You worked in the oil and gas industry. That's a tough job. Then you worked in portable toiletry cleansing, and you were kind of out of it going, man, what do I do from here? How do I change my life? And you started to see some things around fly fishing, but you had a pretty dramatic change in your life that really, I think, mentally helped you push over the edge. Can you talk about that? And then what we're going to do is dive into the I guess you could say, learning how to catch fish in difficult waters, difficult waterways, because the areas that you fish are pretty picky. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about that. And then at the end of the day, you have a dry dropper tip that is extremely valuable. And it's not only dry dropper, but it's really learning how to nymph with a dry dropper. And that's different. So let's go back in time here. You're in this job where you're cleansing porta potties and you're just going, this just isn't me. I mean, I'm making money, but like, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? And then you had this incident, and tell me what maybe the incident was and how it changed your life for you.
Yeah. So it was actually prior to me cleaning Brenna-Johns. It was when I was in the oil and natural gas industry. But that's kind of what kickstarted everything in that direction. I lost my dad in an accident. It was just a freak ATV accident about 5 years ago. And, we were really close growing up and he's responsible for, teaching me how to hunt, teaching me how to fish, always, bringing me into the outdoors as a kid and really sparked my interest in everything that is outdoors and especially fishing. And, so about 5 years ago, he passed away, and I was still working in the natural gas industry, working like 60 hours a week. I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do, but it was paying the bills. It was reliable work. Mm-hmm. And then about 3 years ago, at work kind of slowed down, dried up, and I ended up getting laid off. And it was the same year my firstborn was going to be born.
Okay.
So at that point, when I was laid off, I knew that I was ready to do something that I actually enjoyed for a living. And I had been mulling around, starting to guide. And with the birth of my son coming up, I decided to, hold off for one more year because I didn't want to start that with a newborn. And so I got a job at a local business. It was 5 minutes from my house, cleaning porta-johns. I'm never too proud to do any job. Yeah. And it again paid the bills, and it was kind of a bridge job to get me to guiding. And we ended up having a second child the following year, so 2 years of cleaning porta-johns. But ironically, through cleaning porta-johns is how I became a guide. On my route was Cross Current Outfitters on the Upper Delaware system. And so, when I went up there to clean the porta-john at the boat launch right behind the shop, I'd always stop in and,
talk fish.
Talk fish. Yeah. Just, bullshit with Joe and just through getting to know me. Well, I was planning on starting my own guiding business on the Susquehanna because it's 5 minutes. It's 5 minutes from my house. So I was going to start, fly fishing or guided fly fishing trips on the Susquehanna. I had just bought a drift boat. I had ordered it. from Clacka Craft. I mean, that alone was going to take 8 months for the build to be done. So I knew that year was out already. So I was
Right,
planning on
right.
starting the following year. And just from talking to Joe, going in and out, on my weekly visits to clean the honey pots,
Yeah.
he got to know me, and when I was telling him about how I was planning on starting to guide myself, he offered me a position to guide for him. He thought I had a good personality to be a guide, and he offered me a position guiding for cross current outfitters on the Upper Delaware system. And trout fishing was always my, that was my first love as far as species goes.
Yeah.
And when he offered me that position to guide for him, especially with the reputation he has up there and his knowledge on the Upper Delaware system, I would have
Right.
been foolish to turn down the offer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
last year was my first year guiding for Joe. Absolutely loved it. It was the best decision I've ever made, was deciding to start guiding.
That's really cool, man. Well, of course, very sorry to hear about your father. It's
Thank you.
never easy in that scenario, but just the short periods of time we've spent together, he did a good job, man. You're a good guy, and you've obviously made some intelligent decisions along the way, especially with this fishing outfit with Joe. Joe's a great person, and we're really excited to see you, taking over some time at the shop, et cetera. So great for you. So let's do this. Let's jump into the Upper Delaware. Some of the waters around there that you fish, they're really technical. The fish are picky.
Yes.
And I think you described it to me earlier as it's as in a unique scenario in that, Christian, there are always bugs around and there are tons of bugs, but it seems like it's almost impossible to get fish to eat sometimes. So kind of walk us through that and what your thoughts are. And then we could talk about techniques and strategies that you use.
Yeah. So one thing that makes the Delaware so difficult, and it's a great fishery. It's a very rewarding fishery, but it is difficult, and just how prolific the hatches can be on the Delaware system, and how many bugs are in that river is incredible. And for that reason, these fish can be as picky as they want to be. They're not as opportunistic as other fisheries, because the food is always there. They're never scrounging. So what that does is it makes it especially important to match the hatch, but also probably more than anything is to get a great presentation. Up on the Upper Delaware, if you're not fishing a downstream presentation to rising fish, you're going to have issues just right off the get-go. You kind of have to be above these fish, and that fly should be the first thing that they're looking at.
Yep.
If your tippet's going over them first, or if there's minuscule drag, I mean drag that you won't even see.
Yeah, micro drag, crazy scenarios.
Right. I mean, you might be looking at your fly and thinking you're getting a good drift, but I mean, that fish is seeing something you're not seeing. And unless you get that fly to look like the real deal, I mean, they're not going to eat. So, that downstream presentation is critical for presentation.
So when you're executing downstream presentation, are you doing that from the boat primarily, or are you wade fishing into those scenarios as well, just in the same manner?
Both, but the boat absolutely makes things easier. That's we do wade trips. We also and we also guide out of our drift boats. But even if a customer or client wants to wade fish, usually I suggest taking the boat. If nothing else, to use it as a taxi to fish different water throughout the system and to keep moving to fresh water. That way we're not limiting ourselves. We can still hop out of the boat as much as we want.
Yep.
And the other reason is it really helps to put yourself in the best position to cast to some of these fish. Because the Delaware is a big river. I mean, there's a lot of water that you can't reach on foot.
Yep.
So you're limiting yourself on a guided trip if you just want to wade. The boat is a very useful tool to get yourself in good position to some of these fish that would otherwise be beyond reach.
Yeah, yeah. And when you're utilizing the boat, what percentage of the time are you anchoring up and casting the fish from the boat, or holding per se?
Percentage of the time, well, depends on the day.
Yeah. Okay.
As long as we have targets, um, you know, we could be, well, very often we're paddling out in the dark because we've been
Yeah.
hung up on a fish until dark,
Right. Right. Right.
until we can't see anymore. We're
Right.
we're gonna fish until we can't see, and then we're gonna row it back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it depends on the day. If there's a good hatch going on, I have to make sure we're pacing that boat to get back to the launch on time because we may be anchored up, most of the day.
Okay. Cool. Cool. And your presentation from the boat, talk up a little bit about some of the different tactics that you like to use while fishing from the boat, and getting that fly to have the right kind of presentation, drift, etc.
Yeah. So what I like to do, especially early in the day, so typically our days will start. We like to fish right until dark when the fishing's the best. So we'll start, if it gets dark at 9, we're starting around 1. If it gets dark at 8, we're starting around noon. So we really want those nighttime hours. But
Okay.
until then, early in the afternoon, 1, 2, 3 o'clock, before anything really starts happening, we're going to primarily nymph, and we're also going to throw dry droppers.
Mm.
Um, it's tough to Euro nymph out of a boat, so most of that's done under an indicator. We'll use 2 or 3 fly rigs, but I personally prefer to throw dry droppers whenever possible because it's just more fun.
Yeah.
We all want to look at a bobber that can get eaten, and it's just a lot more fun to fish a dry dropper than it is fishing
Yeah.
a bobber.
It's a little easier to
In my
cast
personal
too.
opinion, yeah, and it's certainly more easier to cast. Yeah, more
Yeah.
easy to cast, and we have enough species of bugs that are on the larger side. I mean, even the Hendricksons, they might be a 14, which isn't enormous, but is big enough to hold up a small
Mm-hmm.
nymph. And so as soon as the Hendricksons are starting, which is late April, so pretty much the beginning of the season, we'll have a bug that I can rig a dry dropper right through. It'll go from the Hendricksons to the March Browns, then the Drakes, and then the
Mm-hmm.
Isonychia starts in June, and we have that until the end of October. So really, there's always a decent sized mayfly that we can use as our top fly.
Okay. Okay. And
So
when you're nymphing, are you still using your downstream presentation on that? Is it like a 90-degree to downstream approach that you use?
So if we're nymphing, it's not as important to have that downstream presentation. The nice part about nymphing out of a boat is, you could even cast it, 10 feet off the boat if the water's broken enough.
Yeah.
The fish just aren't going to spook as easy, especially if you're fishing that broken water and those riffles. So you don't, the presentation, it's still important that you're getting a drag-free drift, but you really don't need to be way ahead of the boat and down at a 45 if you're nymphing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say the same goes for the dry dropper. I mean, you want to be farther off the boat, obviously, a little bit, but you don't have to be way up ahead of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know, I mean, Joe, he's an emerger guy. That's
Yes.
his style.
Yep.
Do you by chance swing wets from the boat very often?
From time to time, yeah. Depending on what's going on. Actually, as far as wets go, I'm probably most likely to swing wets during a caddis hatch.
Yep.
Mostly because when the fish are keying in on the caddis, 90% of the time they're not eating those flies on the surface. They're taking
No.
them right before they break the surface, just as they're getting ready to come to the top where they're most vulnerable. Because when a caddis breaks that surface, they're off pretty quick.
Yeah.
So those fish, even when you're seeing the rise, you're usually just seeing the top of their back.
Yeah.
It's not a true form rise. So swinging wets, like LaFontaine, spiders, anything of that nature, it can be a really good tactic during a caddis hatch. I mean, what I'll do sometimes, I mean, you'll find a fish rising to a caddis, and I will specifically tie on a wet fly or
Yep.
La Fontaine, and you'll still be able to see the take, even though you can't see the fly. As long as you have a good idea where that fly is, if you see that fish's back come out of the water and your fly's in that area, you want to lift that rod because there's a
Yeah.
good chance it took your fly.
Yeah. I love in a caddis hatch when that's going on. If I fish a dry and then I have a wet fly as a dropper,
Mm-hmm.
and I go just a little bit longer, you know, and then I always make sure at the end of my drift, I fish a lot of downstream,
Yep.
and I always make sure at the end of my drift, I just let it hang and kind of dangle.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's amazing how many times you'll pick up fish,
Mm-hmm.
even on the lift by accident,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just the nature of that bug and how they get off the water, and I mean, something about that skitter, as much as it goes against everything we're taught
The
about fly
rules,
fishing.
right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I it can be. I've had good fish eat the bug on that down and across skitter on the surface. It just
Yeah.
something about it drives them nuts.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I tie a, it's like an elk hair caddis, but for the body, I start out with a, oh, we got some dogs in the background here going, guys. Um, must be the mailman. But long story short, I have like an elk hair caddis that is like a foam body. So
Okay.
it's super buoyant.
Yep.
Just never gets wet, never really sinks. And one of the things that's great about it is when you fish downstream, if you make a cast and you don't have a really great um, drift going, or you're not in the right line, you can lift your rod tip, pull the line tight, and then
Yep.
just drop it again, and it adds slack to the line and
Mm-hmm.
sets you all up again for a whole new run at it. So it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because for as well known as the Delaware is for the mayflies, we have great caddis hatches too, and you never want to not have any in your box. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Right. So when you say you want a really good presentation, what are the elements of a really good presentation for you?
So the one, if you can learn to cast any specific way, and if there's any one tip I can give somebody, it's to learn a reach cast on the
Hmm.
Delaware because what you're doing with that reach cast is it's an aerial mend. So you're going to cast out. And as that line's extending, right around the time when you're starting to feel that fly line tug, you're going to want to let a little extra line slide out of your left hand, your line hand, and reach upstream. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull back on the fly a little bit, but it's going to put that elbow in your line, almost an L, and it's going to give you enough slack that you're going to get a pretty good drift without having to mend once your line hits the water. And
Hmm.
that's a very important cast to learn for fishing the Delaware.
Yeah.
That's one of the most important things you can learn up there is learning how to reach cast.
Yeah. And it is, it's a deadly technique. And you nailed it right at the beginning. I love it because I was going to interject and say it's not a cast, it's aerial mend.
Mm-hmm.
So in the way to describe that is a cast is it hits the water.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're doing is you're actually mending the line before it hits the water. So it's really important to understand that because otherwise, what people do is they cast and then they try to push it over. And it's not really pushing, but the last little bit of line. And so
Yeah.
it's not changing the direction of your fly and leader.
Mm.
So super cool. The other one I would maybe ask about would be, do you employ the wiggle cast much?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, depending, especially if you're casting straight down to a fish,
Mm-hmm.
putting those S curves in the line and creating that extra slack, that's absolutely, a cast that we would use.
Yeah, that's a great one. I love those are two casts I love practicing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to do because it's so descriptive in nature.
Yep.
You can literally go cast in a park, put a hula hoop out in front of you and cast to it, but put wiggles into it. And what I like to do is look at the hoop. And the hoop to me is that's the sight of vision of the fish.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to do is land my wiggle cast about a foot to 2 feet ahead of that, with the wiggles in it, and I want to make sure the wiggles look pretty good. You know, are they wide? Do I need
Yes.
more? Do I need less? So I practice that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same distance, but with more or less. And then for the reach cast, same thing. I stand and I have usually like 3 hula hoops spaced apart in front of me, and I have one in the center and then one on the right and one on the left. And then I practice my reach cast to each side. And same kind of thing. I'm always aiming ahead or around those hula hoops because I say that's their line of vision, but how do I get it into that zone with the
Right.
drag feed drift? Because I don't want to land there. I want to land before that so it has time to present
Right.
correctly.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and that's a great exercise to do. And you know, mentioning that too, that's another thing I like to suggest, you know, to people too, is practice in your yard, practice in the park, like you said, because 5 minutes a day of casting in your yard will do more for your cast than you could imagine. It's and that's another thing on the Delaware too. You know, by June, especially July, you know, you can't get very close to these fish, especially in a boat. So it's important to be able to cast. I mean, you don't have to cast 80 feet,
right.
but you should be able to cast 40, 45, you know, because as the season goes on, they get spookier and spookier.
Right.
But so yeah, working in your yard or in the park is a great thing to do. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the thing that's really cool about practicing like that is really working on your double haul
Mm-hmm.
and your single haul because you know, casting 45 yards all day
Mm-hmm.
without that, that's a lot of casting. But
Yeah.
with that, it's like such a calmer and
Mm-hmm.
enjoyable, like light casting environment. You can
Mm-hmm.
have a lot more control, power. You can sometimes fish a little longer because the wind might be picking up, but you can
Mm-hmm.
cut through that still for a long
Sure.
time. You know, all those little scenarios. So great
Yeah.
point.
And you know, that leads me into something else too. You know, if you're going to spend money on something, I mean, a nice rod is a good thing to spend money on. The reel, as long as it has a good drag system, you know, it's good. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is a good fly line.
Mm-hmm.
It's you will get so much out of a good fly line. It can be a bit of sticker shock when you look at some of the fly lines
Yeah.
and see that they're $110, $120. But the ease in which they will make casting for you, you know, it's it's until you cast one, it's hard to put it into words. But yeah, some of these top of the line fly lines are worth the money because, you know, you could cast 30, 35 feet and you don't have to false cast. You know,
Yep.
you do one back cast and come forward again. And, you know, especially fishing these, you know, these fish, as spooky as they are, you don't want to be false casting very much. So
Right.
if you have if you have a good fly line where you could just pick it up and put it right back down again, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, it sure does. And fly lines, you know, probably have had the most enhancement as a product in the last, I don't know, 10 years
Mm-hmm.
than anything else. I mean,
Yeah.
rods have become more accessible. I wouldn't say that they've had that much improvement in design, but they're more accessible, meaning there's far more opportunities out there for them.
Right.
But lines, it's like, it used to be, you know, there were like a couple lines you could get.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, level line, a weight forward line. That was it.
Yeah.
You know, pick your weight. And now it's like you got this taper, that taper, this grain weight, that grain weight,
Mm-hmm.
you know, et cetera, et cetera. So your ability to really get something that works for you and what you're trying to accomplish, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are areas where you want a level line. There are areas where you want a weight forward line, et cetera. And really taking advantage of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, and pretty much all the manufacturers carry a high-end fly line now. Orvis has some great ones. The kind that I use, Cy Angler's Amplitude frequency on a lot of my rods. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a really good line. So I mean, it's buy once, cry once. I think that's one thing. If you're going to spend money on fly line, should be it.
Yeah, I love that. Buy once, cry once.
Yep.
I use all kinds of different lines. I test them all the time. One of the ones that I've been enjoying lately is Monic. They're a
Okay.
PVC free line. and their lines I've been really happy with. Durable, they float real nice, etc. So pretty cool there too. But you're right, Rio, SA, Cortland. I mean, you just go down the list of who has lines, and then you can start to go, okay, here's the different changes and calibers of line, et cetera, et cetera. And the hard thing is you gotta use them, to really figure it out. So I think the key is aiming towards lines where you have an idea of where you want the weight and why, and what that's going to do to your rod. So is it going to put more bend into my rod? Is it going to be slappy on the water, or whatever it's going to do? And then start to work from those points backwards and try and find something that's right. And you could do things to change your line too with your leader, right? So you can go longer, heavier, thinner leaders, et cetera, to change that too. So very cool. All right, so let's do this. You're on the Upper Delaware. You're fishing. You're primarily fishing downstream. You have a customer who's out there and they're casting, and they're just not getting their cast in the right place for presentation. What are some of the things that you start to look for, and how you might tutor them to help them out?
Yeah. So what I can do is, depending on the time of year, that's that has something to do with it too. If it's early in the season, I can usually put the boat pretty close to fish without putting them down. Later in the season, not so much. That's when it gets a little tougher. But what we can do is, we can try to find some fish in some shallower water that we can wade to, because you can get closer to the fish if you're in the water than the boat. You're keeping a lower profile. So, I mean, that's one thing that I like to do, especially if somebody doesn't have a lot of experience casting and they're having a difficult time. We'll just, we'll move to some spots that are a little easier to fish. And, we don't beat ourselves up over the same fish for too long also, because some fish you're just not going to convince to eat, no matter what you do. And it's important to know, when to keep hammering that fish and when to just move on and find a more agreeable fish, because there's going to be one there somewhere that's willing to play.
Yeah. When they're fishing, you kind of have the idea of like, hey, this is a nice fish. We want to stick around and try and pick this thing off. Are you employing fly changes? Are you changing leader lengths?
Yeah. So once I like to see, 2 or 3 good presentations over the fish. Once we get 2 or 3 passes over that fish and they're not eating, we're going to change a fly, or we're going to extend a leader. One of those two things. A lot of times it's just going to a fly that's a size or 2 smaller. Could it even be the same pattern? It's just, they're picking up on that difference in profile. So definitely downsizing is one thing I like to do first. As a fisherman, if you're out there by yourself, a good idea is to carry like a little bait net or a seine, because a lot of times there's bugs in the water that they're not flying around yet, but they're on the water and they may be eating something totally different than what you think they're eating. So, as a client's casting to a fish, or especially if they get a good cast or 2 over them and they don't pay any attention to the fly, I'm paying good attention to what is currently in the water and getting my head close to the water to try and figure out what that fish may be eating. Because, sometimes there's 3-4 different bugs hatching at the same time.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I mean, I go back to, I got a buddy, he carries a seine everywhere we go. Yeah. And I'm always like, hey, you got that seine?
Yeah, because
I have mine.
I'm sure we've always tried to grab a bug out of the water with our hands.
Yeah,
and it is not easy to do.
It's not. I've done as much as like I'll pull my sleeve real long on my shirt and put it in the water and try and collect that way.
Yeah,
it's easier. Hats work really good.
Hats are good too.
So those are some things. But then there's like he does a seine, but one of the other practices I like, and I'm curious to hear if you do this, is a lot of times when the first time I catch fish, especially on days where I'm like, man, it's gonna be hard, or it has been hard, I'll pump their stomach. Do you do that?
Typically I don't, but I do have a pump, and I mean, if it's extremely tricky, I'm not opposed to it. Just got to be careful with the fish. But
Yep.
yeah, I mean, if you're having trouble, pump's not a bad idea.
Yeah, that's what I like to do on those days where I'm like, man, it's I can see fish, I can see them eating. We
Hmm.
don't know what's going on. Like something's happening here, and sure enough, you pump your stomach, and you're like, oh, I wasn't even seeing that,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you're into it pretty good. So it's
Hmm.
really cool. I like that. Okay, let's talk real quick about this because I want to save some time for the tip of the day, but um, let's talk about the education side of you taking people out. Do you have some goals in mind on like, hey, at the beginning of the day, most people that come to me, they want to learn how to fly fish. I want to teach them this area, but I also want to teach them a little bit more about fly fishing and maybe how to make educated decisions and things like that. Do you have any kind of go-tos there that you like to utilize and you see regular instances on the water?
Um, Before I start every day, the most important thing to me is I want everybody to have a good time. I want them to, everybody's, nobody's going fishing because, nobody's there because they don't want to be there. Like everybody's there because they want to fish, they want to have fun.
Yeah.
So that's the big thing. It's a tough fishery. So I mean, some days, once in a while you get blanked. It's going to happen. So it's important for me to make sure everybody has as much fun as possible. And that river's got so much to offer. The scenery, the wildlife. It's not hard to have a good day on the water, even if the fishing is slow.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try. The other thing I'm going to try to do, besides have get them to have a fun time on the water, is maybe I'm going to try to teach them something they didn't know before that day.
Okay.
So I'll go through multiple tactics I use or that I think might be able to improve our chances. And we're going to grind. So if one thing's not working, we're going to switch it up. If there's nothing on the surface, we're going to nymph. And sometimes what we'll do is if there's really nothing going on dry fly wise. And usually you can always drum up a couple fish doing it is just nymphing the riffles. And what we'll do, and myself and multiple guides up on the river will do this. You'll see them outside of the drift boat holding on to the back of it in the riffles because you can't anchor up, in
Right.
that current. But we'll hop out of the boat and we'll hold on to the back of the drift boat and just slowly walk down through the riffle and we'll just really pick it apart with the bobbers going down through.
Yeah.
And it's giving you enough time to really cover that riffle and present the fly to a lot of different fish. And doing that, you're probably not going to get skunked. We'll usually get a
Yeah.
fish somehow.
Yeah.
But that's one thing I like to do is we'll really pick apart the riffles if it's a slow day or if somebody's really struggling, especially newer fly fishermen that maybe can't cast that well yet. Um, you know we're gonna nymph, but we also use dry droppers a lot too. So that
Yeah.
way you're still getting the dry fly fish because everybody wants to do it, and you're also nymphing. So
Right, right, yeah. And I like that. I like fishing the riffles, especially with people who are a little newer, et cetera, because you're just increasing your odds in a lot of
mhm,
way, right? Of like, hey, now I've got this moving object. I've got more deflection in the object, less time to make a decision. I mean, you just go down the
mhm,
list of all the
yeah,
things that need to occur for something to be right in super still water. And you're like, wow, man, we're really stacking the odds against us. And
mhm,
I interviewed someone the other day and they said, let's face it, we're fly fishing. We're trying to make it harder on ourselves.
yeah,
And I think, sometimes if we just take a step back and we go, okay, well, how much harder are we trying to make?
mhm,
And we work from there. And then we go, okay, well, yeah, this guy's super seasoned. He wants that still water-ish
mhm,
dry fly eat and like ultra slow or whatever it is, but just, perfection.
mhm,
Whereas the other guys, like, I just want to be able to see that, or
yeah,
I just want to get a fish on my line to feel it,
mhm, yeah.
you know, and everybody has their own goals. So it was really cool to see you be able to accommodate that. Um, one of the things I like to do when I'm guiding is share a few little tips. And one of my favorite tips is I tie a clinch knot or a Davy knot with a pair of forceps, right? And
Okay. Yep.
it's really, there's some tricks on my YouTube page if you guys want to go check that out. It's like, I think I call it the fastest clinch knot. And I do it with the Davy knot too, which is also, maybe I'll make a video on that. But long story short, it helps me in a ton of ways. One, it's really fast, so I become really efficient. Two, I get some bad eyes. And tying knots with your bad eyes and forceps is like, there's no thinking about it. It's so easy. So that helps a ton. But what I wanted to talk about today was you had a tip on fishing a dry dropper. And in particular to that dry dropper setup, you like to fish a little more on the nymph heavy side. So why don't you kind of give us a scenario of like, hey, this is what my rig is, Christian, and this is how I'd like to utilize that and why.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing I like to do, and I do this a lot myself also. If I get, the few chances I have to fish myself, is I'll use a dry dropper setup in the riffles, and I'm primarily fishing the nymph. And what I'll do is, I'll tie on whatever the prominent dry fly is or large mayfly is that's hatching at the time. So let's just say it's a drake. There's green drake, so I'll tie on like a bushy green drake or a parachute drake, and then I'll hang off the bottom. I'll figure out about what the average depth is, and let's just say it's 2 feet. So I'll tie 2.5 feet of tippet on underneath. Usually I'll go a diameter lighter than what my dry fly is, so I don't lose the whole rig. If we get snagged on the bottom, we'll just lose the nymph. And I'll tie on a perdigon or a small Frenchie or just a lightweight tungsten headed nymph that's going to get down there, but it's not going to pull that dry fly under. And we're going to fish the riffle like a grid, and we're actually going to do it upstream, which goes against
your typical
what I'm
rule.
saying.
Yeah,
right. But again, we're fishing more of that nymph. Our indicator is the dry fly, and we have a very sensitive indicator that the fish can still eat. So you're still fishing that dry fly, but really you're fishing the nymph, and that's where you're going to get most of your takes. And I'll fish it with an upstream presentation. I'll almost tight line that dry fly. So I'm not casting far. I'm not casting way out across. I might only have 10, 15 feet of line out, and I'm just casting upstream, and I'll start upstream and to my left and make 5, 10 casts over to the right, and then I'll take another step or two upstream and just really work that water like a grid and pick it apart with that dry dropper and cover every single lane. And usually they're going to take the nymph, but a lot of times they'll surprise you and come up and hammer that dry fly too, because you're going to get away with more too because you're in the riffle. If you're new and you're really struggling, or even if you're not new and you're really struggling, there's fish everywhere in the Delaware. It doesn't matter where people are standing. There is fish everywhere in that river. So get to the water that's broken, the water that's moving a little bit faster, some boulders. That turbulence is going to make it harder for the fish to see the imperfections in your presentation, and it's going to make it so you can get away with a little bit more too.
Yeah, it really does. And so, are you also employing some of the like kind of almost dapping style techniques as well with that dry fly? Are you kind of like jigging that a little bit onto the surface, and or are you really looking for that tight line kind of nymphing style and just using that fly as the indicator? I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, typically I'm more or less just tight lining that dry fly. If that dry fly goes under, it's probably a fish. Especially if you're fishing that perdigon, it does a pretty good job, or a Frenchie or anything on a jig style hook.
Right.
Does a pretty good job of preventing snags. I mean, you might get vegetation from here to here, from time to time, but usually if that fly dives under pretty quick, it's a fish that grabbed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, typically I'm tight lining it, and I'm only fishing 10 to 15 feet in front of me. You're not going to get long drifts. You're going to be casting, your rig quite a bit.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to be able to cover a lot of water, but you're you're able to cover, you're really able to break it down and get behind every rock.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you use any kind of different casting techniques? Like, do you finish your rod tip really high or anything like that? Talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit.
Yeah. So actually, I'll almost incorporate like a tuck cast. If you've ever heard of Joe Humphrey's tuck cast that he does,
Yeah.
that really gets everything to turn over pretty quick. And I do like to stop that rod tip up high, and let that nymph be the first thing that's hitting the water to avoid a tangle.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of how I like to use it, as a tuck cast, or some people call it like upper downer type thing,
Yep.
where you're really projecting that bottom fly to go in first
Mm-hmm.
and be your entry point, and then everything else follows. And it does a couple things. One, allows the fly to hit first, and two, it'll actually project your fly and kind of shoot it into and through the water column. So you're getting deep really fast, which is super important on, like you said, that 10 to 15 foot drift, because it's 10 to 15 feet. Well, on a standard cast, you'd maybe only be getting 4 feet of actual drift at the right depth. But with tuck cast, you're getting 8 feet.
Exactly. Yeah, you're gonna, the tuck cast is helping you, and that style of fly too. That's gonna it's gonna sink like a rock and get right down. And that's what you're trying to do. When you're fishing that water, you're trying to get down in the strike zone as quickly as possible to kind of maximize your drift.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, I'll say it, man. Bill, it's been great having you on the show. Really good getting to know you. I'm super happy to hear that Joe has someone like you on the team. Joe's a great guy. Go back to listen to Joe DeMalderez's podcast. It's on emergers. And Bill, once again, appreciate it, man. We'll see you guys next time and go from there.